March 15th, 2020, 6 a.m. James Morrison walks out of a homeless shelter for the last time, carrying a notebook that contains evidence of a crime so heinous it would destroy hundreds of lives. In 3 hours, he'll be dead. In 4 years, his murder will expose a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of veteran care in America. But here's what nobody knew on that morning. James Morrison was walking into a trap. The man who killed him had been watching him for weeks, planning his murder, preparing to bury the truth along with the body. And if it wasn't for a 67-year-old retired teacher with a metal detector, James Morrison's killer would still be free today, still robbing veterans, still destroying lives. This is the story of how a simple act of kindness, feeding stray cats in a park, became the key to solving a murder that nobody even knew had happened. James Morrison wasn't supposed to be living in a homeless shelter. With his military background and disability benefits, he should have been stable, housed, living the life he'd earned through his service to this country. But life rarely follows the script we write for ourselves. The Riverside Community Shelter had become his home for 8 months by March of 2020. But here's what made James different from many of the other residents. He had hope. He had structure. He had a routine that kept him grounded in a world that seemed determined to knock him down. Every single morning at exactly 6 a.m., James would walk out of the shelter and head 3 blocks to Riverside Park. Rain or shine, scorching heat or California winter chill, he'd sit on the same bench by the duck pond. And there, he'd do something beautiful. He'd feed the stray cats that had made the park their home. Now you might be thinking, why focus on this detail? Hold that thought, because this simple act of compassion would eventually become the thread that unraveled everything. But there's something else about James's routine that made him special. Something that would ultimately make him a target. The shelter staff knew James well. Marcus Webb, the director, often praised James as one of their success stories. "He's the kind of resident who gives us hope," Webb would tell visitors and volunteers. "Always says thank you, helps newcomers navigate the system, never misses his appointments. If everyone was like James, our job would be so much easier." But there was another side to James Morrison that most people didn't see. Something that would prove to be both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. James had served in the Army for 12 years, and part of his military training had included accounting and financial management. He was good with numbers. Really good. And when you're good with numbers, you start noticing patterns. You start seeing when things don't add up. And at the Riverside Community Shelter, things were definitely not adding up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the discovery that would change everything the moment James Morrison realized he wasn't just helping fellow veterans navigate the system, but uncovering a conspiracy that went right to the top of the organization meant to protect them. By early 2020, James had become the unofficial helper for many of the veterans at the shelter. It wasn't an official position. James just couldn't stand to see his fellow servicemen struggling alone. He'd help them fill out paperwork, navigate the VA system, and understand their benefits. It was during these informal counseling sessions that James started noticing something that didn't sit right with him. "My disability check was supposed to be $1,200 this month," a Vietnam veteran named Robert told him one February morning. "But I only got $900. They said there were administrative fees, but I've never had administrative fees before." Another veteran, Maria, who had served in Iraq, complained about missing donations. "Someone came by last week and said they donated $500 specifically for me to help with my medical bills. But when I asked Mr. Webb about it, he said he had no record of any donation." At first, James thought it was just bureaucratic confusion. The system was complicated, mistakes happened, and veterans often struggled to understand the complex web of benefits and aid programs. But as he helped more veterans, a pattern began to emerge that sent chills down his spine. Small amounts were consistently missing from disability payments. Donations that were supposed to go directly to specific veterans mysteriously disappeared. Government aid was being redirected or reduced without explanation, and every time someone asked questions, they were told it was administrative fees, or processing costs, or simply a mistake in the system. Here's where James Morrison's military training kicked in. He'd learned in the Army that documentation was everything. If you couldn't prove it, it didn't happen. So James started keeping records meticulous. detailed records. In a small notebook that he carried everywhere, James began tracking every discrepancy he found. Account numbers, dates, amounts. The names of the veterans affected everything was meticulously recorded. He even started making copies of documents when he could, building what he thought was just a file to help veterans get the money they were owed. But James Morrison wasn't just documenting administrative errors. He was building a case against someone who was systematically stealing from the most vulnerable people in society, and that someone was about to realize that James Morrison was getting too close to the truth. What James didn't know was that his questions weren't going unnoticed. Every time he helped a veteran challenge a missing payment, every time he asked about donations that had disappeared, every time he requested documentation, someone was watching. Someone was keeping track of his investigation, and that someone was about to make sure James Morrison never got the chance to expose what he discovered. But before we get to that fateful morning in March, let me tell you about the conversation that sealed James's fate the moment he made the decision that would save hundreds of veterans but cost him his life. February 28, 2020. James Morrison requested a meeting with Marcus Webb, the shelter director. It was a meeting that would set in motion a chain of events that would end in murder. James had been documenting irregularities for months, but what he discovered in the past week had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just small amounts being skimmed here and there. It was systematic, coordinated theft on a massive scale. "Mr. Webb," James said, sitting across from the director in his office, "I've been helping some of the veterans here with their paperwork, and I've noticed some discrepancies in their accounts." Webb smiled, that easy, practiced smile that had fooled donors, volunteers, and city officials for years. "Oh, James, I appreciate your concern, but the financial side of running this shelter is quite complex. There are always fees, administrative costs, processing delays. It's not something our residents need to worry about." But James Morrison wasn't just any resident. He was a veteran with financial training, and he'd been building a case that would expose Webb's crimes. "I'm not talking about normal administrative costs," James said, pulling out his notebook. "I'm talking about $50,000 in donations that have gone missing over the past 6 months. I'm talking about disability payments that are being reduced without explanation. I'm talking about government aid that's being redirected to accounts that don't belong to the veterans it's meant to help." The smile disappeared from Webb's face. "James, I think you're overcomplicating things. Maybe you should focus on your own recovery instead of worrying about financial matters that are above your pay grade." It was the wrong thing to say to a man who had served his country for 12 years. James Morrison straightened in his chair, and for a moment Webb saw not a homeless veteran, but a soldier who had been trained to protect and serve. "These men trusted me to help them," James said. "They trusted me to speak up when something wasn't right. And what you're doing? It's not right, it's theft, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." Webb tried to backtrack, tried to smooth things over, but James was done with diplomatic solutions. He tried to handle this quietly, tried to give Webb the benefit of the doubt, but the evidence was overwhelming. Someone was systematically robbing veterans of their benefits, and James Morrison wasn't going to let it continue. "I'm going to the police," James said, standing up. "I'm going to the VA. I'm going to the newspapers. Whatever it takes to make sure these men get what they're owed." As James left the office, Webb watched him go with a mixture of fear and rage. James Morrison had just signed his own death warrant, though he didn't know it yet. For the next 2 weeks, Webb watched James like a hawk. He saw him continuing to help veterans, continuing to document discrepancies, continuing to build his case. And Webb knew that it was only a matter of time before James followed through on his threat. That's when Webb made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided that James Morrison had to be stopped. Permanently, March 15th, 2020. 6 a.m. James Morrison left the Riverside Community Shelter for what would be the last time. He followed his usual route to the park, carrying his small bag of cat food and his notebook filled with evidence that would eventually bring down Marcus Webb. But this morning was different. This morning, James wasn't alone. Marcus Webb had been planning this for days. He'd studied James's routine, knew exactly where he would be and when. He'd prepared his story, prepared his alibi, prepared everything except for the reality of what he was about to do. Webb met James at the park entrance, claiming he wanted to talk about their conversation from 2 weeks earlier. "I've been thinking about what you said," Webb told him. "Maybe we can work something out. Maybe there's a way to handle this that doesn't involve the police." James was suspicious, but he was also hopeful. If Webb was willing to make things right, if he was willing to return the money he'd stolen, maybe they could resolve this without destroying the shelter that helped so many people. They walked together to James's usual bench by the duck pond. It was early, the park was empty, and the morning mist was just beginning to lift. James sat down and began pulling out his notebook, ready to show Webb the evidence he'd compiled. "Look," James said, "I've documented everything. Every missing payment, every redirected donation, every unexplained fee. If you can explain these discrepancies, if you can show me where this money went, then maybe we can." That's when Webb struck him with the metal pipe. James Morrison never saw it coming. One moment he was trying to help his fellow veterans, the next he was lying on the ground, his blood mixing with the morning dew, his notebook scattered beside him. Webb stood over him, breathing heavily, the pipe still in his hands. He'd told himself he was only going to scare James, only going to make him understand the consequences of threatening the shelter. But when James had pulled out that notebook, when he'd started listing all the evidence he'd gathered, Webb had snapped. For several minutes, Webb stood there in shock, trying to process what he'd done. Then survival instincts kicked in. He couldn't let James's body be found. He couldn't let anyone connect him to this. Webb had brought plastic sheeting in his car, originally planning to use it to wrap up James's notebook and destroy the evidence. Instead, he found himself wrapping up James Morrison's body, preparing to bury the man who had died trying to protect his fellow veterans. But Webb made a crucial mistake. In his panic, he didn't think to search for the notebook. He didn't realize that James Morrison had made copies of everything. He didn't understand that the evidence he'd killed to suppress was about to be buried with the victim, preserved for 4 years until a retired teacher with a metal detector would uncover the truth. When James Morrison failed to return to the shelter on March 15, 2020, Marcus Webb was the first person to express concern. He called the police, filed a missing person report, and cooperated fully with the investigation. He was the picture of a caring administrator worried about one of his success stories. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to the case, but timing couldn't have been worse. Just days after James disappeared, the entire country went into lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Resources were stretched thin, and sadly, the disappearance of a homeless veteran wasn't the city's top priority. Detective Chen did what she could with limited resources. She canvassed the area around the shelter and the park, spoke with other homeless individuals, checked hospitals and morgues, but James Morrison had simply vanished without a trace. Webb's performance during the investigation was masterful. He provided James's personal belongings, his schedule, his contacts, everything that would help find him. He spoke glowingly about James's progress, his hope for the future, his dedication to helping other veterans. "I just can't understand it," Webb told Detective Chen during one of their interviews. "James was doing so well. He was clean, attending counseling, helping other residents. He even had a job interview lined up next week. It doesn't make sense that he'd just disappear." Webb seemed genuinely distraught. He attended search parties, distributed flyers, and even offered a reward for information leading to James's whereabouts. To everyone watching, Marcus Webb was a dedicated public servant desperate to find one of his residents. But appearances can be deceiving, and Webb had 4 years to perfect his act. As weeks turned into months, the case went cold. The pandemic had consumed all available resources, and James Morrison became another statistic, another veteran who'd slipped through the cracks. His disappearance was filed away, and life at the Riverside Community Shelter continued as if nothing had happened. But James Morrison wasn't gone. He was waiting, buried just yards from where he'd spent so many peaceful mornings feeding stray cats. He was waiting for someone to find him, someone to uncover the truth, someone to seek justice for him and the hundreds of veterans who were still being robbed. He was waiting in Riverside Park, and he wouldn't have to wait much longer. Margaret Collins had never expected her retirement hobby to change her life, let alone solve a murder. The 67-year-old former teacher had discovered metal detecting during the pandemic, starting as a way to get exercise and fresh air when everything else was locked down. What began as a simple hobby had become a passion. Margaret would spend hours in parks around the city, sweeping her detector back and forth, finding coins, jewelry, and occasionally genuine treasures. She'd found a Civil War-era button, a vintage wedding ring, and enough bottle caps to fill a small museum. September 2024. Margaret was working her way through Riverside Park, following her usual methodical pattern. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day that made her grateful for her retirement and this peaceful hobby that had become such an important part of her life. She'd been working the area near the duck pond, where she'd found several interesting items over the years. The ground here was soft, easy to dig, and seemed to hold secrets from decades past. Then near the old oak tree where she'd never detected before, her machine began beeping frantically. Not the usual beep for a bottle cap or a piece of aluminum foil, this was different. This was the deep, insistent beep that every metal detector enthusiast dreams of hearing. Margaret began to dig. 3 feet down, deeper than she'd ever found anything before, her small shovel struck something metallic. She carefully brushed away the dirt, expecting to find an old pipe or a piece of buried machinery. Instead, she found herself staring at military dog tags. The name etched into the metal would change everything. Morrison James T. USARMY. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the name. She lived in the area for 30 years, and she remembered the missing veteran from 2020. She remembered the search parties, the flyers, the reward that had been offered. She remembered thinking how sad it was that a man who had served his country had simply vanished. But Margaret was also a retired teacher, and teachers know how to think logically about problems. If James Morrison's dog tags were buried 3 feet underground, then James Morrison was probably buried here too. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore, this was a crime scene. Margaret called 911 with shaking hands. She'd found more than buried treasure, she'd found a man's identity. She'd found the key to a mystery that had haunted the community for 4 years. But the dog tags were just the beginning. What else was buried in that makeshift grave would expose a conspiracy that no one saw coming. When Detective Chen, now Sergeant Chen, after a well-deserved promotion arrived at Riverside Park, she knew immediately that this was the break she'd been waiting for. The forensic team worked methodically, carefully excavating the site while Margaret Collins watched from behind the police tape, still clutching her metal detector. What they found was devastating. James Morrison's remains were wrapped in industrial plastic, buried in a makeshift grave just yards from where he used to sit and feed the stray cats every morning. The irony was heartbreaking. He'd been murdered and buried in the place that had brought him peace. But it was what they found with the body that broke the case wide open. A small notebook, somehow protected by the plastic wrapping, containing detailed financial records and account numbers. James Morrison had been building a case, documenting systematic theft from veterans' accounts, and someone had killed him for it. Sergeant Chen held the notebook with gloved hands, reading page after page of meticulous documentation. James had recorded names, dates, amounts, account numbers, everything needed to build a case against whoever was stealing from the veterans. It was the work of a man who understood that details mattered. The documentation was everything, that the truth had to be preserved even if it cost him his life. The notebook revealed the scope of the crime. Over 3 years, someone had been systematically skimming money from the most vulnerable clients at the shelter. Small amounts that wouldn't be immediately missed, from people who often couldn't advocate for themselves, people who were told that missing money was just administrative fees or processing costs. But the notebook also revealed something else: copies of bank statements, donation records, and government aid documents. James Morrison hadn't just been documenting the theft. He'd been building a legal case that would stand up in court. The trail led directly to Marcus Webb, the shelter director who had seemed so cooperative during the original investigation. The man who had praised James as a success story. The man who had organized search parties and offered rewards. The man who had spent 4 years attending memorial services for missing veterans while knowing exactly where James Morrison was buried. Marcus Webb had been using his position of trust to rob the very people he was supposed to help. And when James Morrison had gotten too close to the truth, Webb had committed murder to protect his secret. But the evidence was about to reveal something even more sinister. This wasn't just about money. This was about power, control, and the systematic exploitation of America's most vulnerable heroes. When detectives arrived at Marcus Webb's office on the morning of September 15th, 2024, they found a man who seemed genuinely surprised to see them. He maintained his composure, expressed appropriate concern about James Morrison's remains being found, and offered to help the investigation in any way he could. "I've been praying for 4 years that we'd find out what happened to James," Webb said, his voice filled with what seemed like genuine emotion. "He was such a good man. He didn't deserve whatever happened to him." But when Sergeant Chen presented him with the notebook, Webb's carefully constructed facade began to crack. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his hands were shaking as he looked at the evidence. James was he was struggling with mental health issues. He was confused about the financial systems. You can't trust what he wrote in some notebook. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed systematic transfers from veterans' accounts to accounts controlled by Webb. Donation records had been altered to hide the theft. Government aid had been redirected to Webb's personal accounts. Over $340,000 had been stolen from veterans over 3 years. Money that should have gone to men and women who had served their country and now had nothing left but their disability checks in the hope that someone cared about them. Confronted with undeniable proof, financial records that couldn't be explained away, and 4 years of systematic theft documented in James Morrison's notebook, Marcus Webb finally broke down. "He was going to ruin everything," Webb said, his voice breaking as the mask finally slipped. "I built that shelter from nothing. I helped hundreds of people. James was going to destroy it all over a few missing dollars. A few missing dollars." That's how Webb described stealing the life savings of men and women who had served their country and now had nothing left but their dignity and their trust in the system meant to help them. But Webb's confession would reveal something even more chilling about James Morrison's final moments and the cold calculation that had led to his murder. In the interrogation room, Marcus Webb finally told the truth about what had happened on March 15th, 2020. His confession painted a picture of a man who had convinced himself that he was the hero of his own story, even as he systematically robbed the most vulnerable people in society. Webb explained how it had started small during the 2008 financial crisis. "The shelter was struggling," he said. "We weren't getting enough donations, and I couldn't pay the bills. I just borrowed a little bit from some of the veterans' accounts, just temporarily, until things got better. But temporary became permanent. Small amounts became larger. And when the economy recovered, Webb didn't stop stealing. He got better at it. I convinced myself I was helping them," Webb said. "I was keeping the shelter running. I was providing them with services. What was a few dollars compared to having a roof over their heads?" Webb had perfected his system over the years. He would skim small amounts from disability payments, telling veterans it was administrative fees. He would redirect donations meant for specific individuals, claiming the money had never arrived. He would manipulate government aid, taking his cut while the veterans received reduced benefits. For over a decade, Webb had been systematically robbing the people he was supposed to help, and he might have gotten away with it forever if not for James Morrison's military training and his dedication to his fellow veterans. "James was different," Webb said. "Most of the residents, they trusted me. They believed me when I told them about fees and processing costs. But James, he asked questions. He wanted to see documentation. He started helping other veterans understand their benefits." Webb's voice grew colder as he described his growing frustration with James's investigation. "I tried to discourage him. I told him he was overcomplicating things, that he should focus on his own recovery. But he wouldn't listen. He kept digging, kept asking questions, kept building his case." The morning of March 15th, 2020, Webb had lured James to the park with the promise of explaining the financial discrepancies. "I thought if I could just talk to him, if I could make him understand how much good the shelter was doing, maybe he'd back down." But James Morrison wouldn't back down. Even homeless, even struggling with his own demons, he wouldn't abandon his principles. He wouldn't let his fellow veterans continue to be robbed. "He told me those men trusted him to speak up for them," Webb said. "He said he'd rather die than let me hurt his brothers." In a moment of rage, Webb had struck James with a metal pipe he'd brought for intimidation. When James fell and didn't get up, Webb panicked. He wrapped the body in plastic sheeting and buried it in the park that same night. For 4 years, Webb had continued his scheme, stealing from the very people he was supposed to help, while attending memorial services for missing veterans and giving interviews about the challenges facing homeless veterans. All while James Morrison lay buried in the park, where he'd shown kindness to stray cats, where he'd found peace in the early morning hours, where he'd maintained his dignity and his humanity, even when the world had forgotten him. Marcus Webb's trial became a media sensation that gripped the nation. The prosecution painted him as a predator who had systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of society. The defense argued that he was a dedicated public servant who had made mistakes under the pressure of running an underfunded shelter. But the jury saw through the defense's arguments. They heard testimony from veterans who had been robbed, many of whom had been living on the streets while Webb stole their benefits. They saw the evidence of systematic theft spanning over a decade. They learned about James Morrison's dedication to protecting his fellow veterans, even at the cost of his own life. Most importantly, they understood that this wasn't about administrative mistakes or financial pressures. This was about trust, dignity, and the sacred covenant between society and those who serve it. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed that Webb had stolen over $340,000 from veterans' accounts. Testimony revealed that he had been living a comfortable lifestyle while the men and women he was supposed to help struggled with homelessness, hunger, and despair. Margaret Collins, the metal detecting enthusiast whose discovery had solved the case, attended every day of the trial. "I never expected my hobby to lead to this," she told reporters. "But I'm glad James Morrison can finally rest in peace, and his fellow veterans can get the help they deserve." The verdict was swift and decisive. Marcus Webb was found guilty of first-degree murder, theft, fraud, and multiple counts of exploiting vulnerable adults. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, Webb addressed the court one final time. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was helping people. I thought I was doing good work." But Judge Patricia Martinez saw through his self-serving narrative. "Mr. Webb, you systematically stole from men and women who had already given everything to their country. You exploited their trust when they were at their most vulnerable. You murdered James Morrison not in a moment of passion, but to protect your criminal enterprise. You are not a victim of circumstances. You are a predator who destroyed lives for your own gain." The judge's words echoed through the courtroom, but they couldn't bring back James Morrison or undo the damage Webb had caused to hundreds of veterans over the years. The investigation into Marcus Webb's crimes revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond the Riverside Community Shelter. Over 200 veterans had been victims of his scheme, and the ripple effects of his theft had destroyed lives, broken families, and betrayed the trust of an entire community. The case sparked nationwide reforms in how homeless shelters are monitored and how veterans' benefits are protected. The James Morrison Veterans Protection Act was passed, requiring strict financial oversight, regular audits, and background checks for anyone handling veterans' benefits. But perhaps the most important change was in how society viewed homeless veterans. James Morrison's story reminded people that behind every statistic was a human being with dignity, worth, and often a story of service and sacrifice that deserved respect and protection. Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen, who had never given up on the case despite the challenges, reflected on the investigation. James Morrison served his country in war and continued serving his fellow veterans in peace. Even in death, his dedication to doing what's right brought justice not just for himself, but for all the veterans who were being exploited. The Riverside Community Shelters now operates under new management with strict financial oversight and transparency requirements. Every transaction is monitored, every donation is tracked, and every veteran's benefits are protected by multiple layers of accountability. The James Morrison Memorial Garden sits in Riverside Park, near the spot where he used to feed stray cats and where he was ultimately laid to rest. The garden features a simple plaque that reads, "In memory of James Morrison, U.S. Army veteran who died protecting those who couldn't protect themselves." Every morning, volunteers continue the tradition James started, feeding the stray cats that still gather in the park. It's a small gesture, but it represents the continuity of kindness that James Morrison believed in. The idea that even the smallest acts of compassion can make a difference in the world. The case also changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases involving homeless individuals. James Morrison's disappearance had been treated as just another homeless person wandering off, but his story demonstrated that every missing person deserves a thorough investigation, regardless of their circumstances. Most importantly, the case highlighted the vulnerability of veterans living on the margins of society and the responsibility we all share to protect those who have served our country. James Morrison's story became a rallying cry for veteran advocacy groups and a reminder that the covenant between society and its veterans must be honored and protected. As I researched this case, I kept coming back to one thought. James Morrison's story could have ended differently. If he had just minded his own business, if he had ignored the financial irregularities, if he had chosen self-preservation over protecting his fellow veterans, he might still be alive today. But that wouldn't have been James Morrison. That wouldn't have been the soldier who served his country for 12 years, the man who helped other veterans navigate the system, the person who got up every morning at 6 a.m. to feed stray cats in a park because he believed that even the smallest acts of kindness mattered. James Morrison died as he lived, putting others before himself. And in death, he accomplished what he couldn't in life. He exposed the corruption that was robbing his fellow veterans. He brought justice to those who had been forgotten. He reminded us that heroes don't always wear uniforms or receive medals. Sometimes heroes are homeless veterans who feed stray cats and keep detailed notebooks about financial irregularities. Sometimes heroes are retired teachers who spend their mornings searching for buried treasure with metal detectors. Sometimes heroes are detectives who refuse to give up on cold cases, even when resources are scarce and the cases seem hopeless. Marcus Webb is serving his sentence in federal prison, where he'll likely spend the rest of his life. The veterans he robbed are finally getting the help they need and deserve. The system has been reformed to prevent future exploitation. Justice has been served, even if it came 4 years too late. But James Morrison is still gone. He's still buried in Riverside Park, still feeding stray cats in our memories, still reminding us that doing the right thing sometimes comes at the ultimate odd. The next time you see a homeless veteran, remember James Morrison. Remember that behind every person living on the margins is a story, a history, a human being deserving of dignity and respect. Remember that the problems of the vulnerable are our problems too, and that sometimes the greatest threats to those in need come from the very people trusted to help them. Remember that James Morrison didn't have to help his fellow veterans. He could have focused on his own recovery, his own problems, his own survival. But he chose to use his skills and his knowledge to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. He chose to speak up when he saw injustice, even when it put him in danger. That's the kind of hero America needs. That's the kind of hero James Morrison was. And that's why his story needed to be told. James Morrison served his country in war and continued serving his fellow veterans in peace. Even in death, his dedication to doing what's right brought justice not just for himself, but for all the veterans who were being exploited by someone they trusted. His legacy lives on in the reform systems that now protect veterans' benefits, in the memorial garden where volunteers continue his tradition of feeding stray cats, and in the reminder that every person, regardless of their circumstances, has value and deserves protection. The James Morrison Memorial Fund continues to provide direct assistance to veterans in need, ensuring that his name and his values live on in concrete help for those who served our country. Because that's what James Morrison would have wanted, not monuments to his memory, but practical help for the people he died trying to protect. In the end, James Morrison's story is not just about one man's courage or one criminal's greed. It's about all of us, about our responsibility to each other, about the importance of speaking up when we see injustice, and about the power of one person's conscience to change the world. That's the legacy of James Morrison, the homeless veteran who uncovered a deadly conspiracy and paid the ultimate price for his dedication to protecting others. His story reminds us that heroes come in all forms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to do what's right, even when it's dangerous. Thank you for watching this video. If you found James Morrison's story moving, please consider supporting organizations that help homeless veterans. The James Morrison Memorial Fund continues to provide direct assistance to veterans in need. Links are in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that matter. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, every person has a story worth telling, and every story deserves to be heard. Until next time, stay safe and never stop fighting for what's right.